Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone that's joining us today. I am Madeline Sullivan, Senior Manager of Contract Marketing. I'd like to welcome you to MillerKnoll's March 20th, 2025 Design Perspectives. As many of you know or don't know, Design Perspectives is our monthly discussion about all things design. And that could be creative design, insights and research, or highlighting products or brands under our collective. And today we are going back into our design heritage to share a CEU on Gilbert Rohde, Herman Miller's first design director in 1932. This past year, we reintroduced the Rohde Easy Chair and the Rohde Paldeo table under our Herman Miller brand. This CEU is part of a series called Modernism's Master Salesman. The CEU illustrates the critical role Rohde played in introducing Americans to modernism. And who better to share this CEU than the notorious Amy Auscherman, Director of Archives and Brand Heritage. After the call, any attendee who indicated they would like to receive CEU credit will receive a certificate for credit in their inbox. Another note, chat will be open for questions. Feel free to drop your questions in at any time, and we will answer any questions at the end of the CEU presentation. And now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Amy. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you so much, Madeline. I'll give everybody a minute. Can we see the screen? Can we hear me? We're on the title slide now. So, okay, I love seeing all the thumbs up at the bottom. Okay, cool. Thank you for that amazing introduction. I'm really excited to talk about this designer today. I think he's one that maybe you heard about in design school, maybe you're aware of, but really was integral in making Herman Miller into the modern furniture company that so many know it as today. So housekeeping up front, as Madeline said, you can register and get credit for these. So here's some of that front matter of what you get. Madeline can also answer questions at the end just to make sure if you are doing this for credit, how exactly to do that. Copyright, fun stuff. So I think Madeline already went through this in terms of course description, but you're going to learn about Gilbert Rohde and his role in selling modernism to America via Herman Miller. At the end, you'll know how Rohde's formative years shaped him into one of the pioneers of American modern design, understand the important role he played in Herman Miller's history, be familiar with his breadth of work, and understand that educating Americans about modernism was the red thread running through all of his work. So here he is. Rohde may have well been the most influential American furniture designer of his time. He introduced modern European design to Americans in a way that appealed to them. He also changed the way furniture was marketed and sold in the United States. He favored new materials and technologies that lent themselves to mass production, making modern design accessible to the masses. He is also the person who first introduced Americans to the idea of systems furniture. Yet he may be less familiar to you than other modern designers of his time, Walter Dorwin Teague, Henry Dreyfuss, Raymond Loewy, but also names like Charles and Ray Eames, George Nelson, Florence Knoll. We were doing the research for this presentation. You know, Rohde's Wikipedia page, despite all he influenced, is a little short. So it's no wonder that he often does not get committed to the canon in the same way of early American design. And in the CEU, we set out to change that. So one of the reasons that you may know less about Rohde is that for a long time, no one knew much about his youth and early adulthood. In 2009, a design scholar named Phyllis Ross came to the Herman Miller archives, which was actually at that point, and I think still is, the largest repository of design-related material to Rohde and his work for Herman Miller. And so Ross spent a couple of summers going through our archives and using it to produce this singular monograph, Gilbert Rohde, Modern Design Modern Living. You can still find it if at the end of this you're like, I'm such a Rohde fan. So overall, she spent more than 10 years researching this book, and at this point, it's the most complete source on Rohde in existence. So Rohde's given name was Gustav, not Gilbert. He was born in the Bronx in 1894 and was the only child of German immigrants, Matilda and Max Rohde. His father was a cabinet maker, but he was out of the picture by the time Rohde was 6. It appears that Rohde's aunt was actually his primary caretaker. By his own account, by Rohde's own account, he was a precocious child. He once told a journalist that he was, quote, plating his mother's teaspoons in his own plating plant when he was just 12. While that is definitely far-fetched, he must have shown some early promise. He was admitted to Stuyvesant High School in New York City, which at the time accepted the most gifted students of the public schools. One of his classmates was Lewis Mumford, who would go on to become a critic at The New Yorker, and really an early thinker about modern furniture, modern design, and its effect on American society. At Stuyvesant, Rohde was able to explore his natural interest in industrial materials. He took classes in cabinet making, metal forging, and mechanical processes. While his classmates tackled making bookends, Rohde wanted to make a wood desk. He also had a natural artistic talent, which he used to draw sketches for the literary magazine and yearbook at his school. So here's one of his cartoons. Rohde early on wanted to be an architect, but didn't have the money to go to school to study. So after graduating from high school in 1913, he worked as a cartoonist and reporter for a local weekly paper. The cartoon you see here is one he drew in 1914. He also worked as a freelance commercial artist. By then, he was already starting to let go of the name Gustav and his German heritage, and kind of, as a lot of immigrants did at that point, kind of anglicizing their names and called himself Gus Rohde or G. Rohde. This is also another reason why early research about him was hard to do. Changed his name. For a long time, no one knew his name was Gustav, so he changed his name to Gilbert when he was in his early 30s. Talk about more why later, kind of said it, but that discovery is really what made it possible for Phyllis Ross to trace his childhood and young adulthood, which, as you will see, is kind of cornerstone to how he turned out as a designer. Rohde was able to avoid the draft in 1917 because he was the sole provider for his mother and aunt, and because he had at the time a disability. He stuttered, and so it was a lifelong condition that mostly occurred on one-on-one situations, which also is remarkable in that he was able to go on and be such a prolific talker and able to talk about these ideas to really anyone. Within a few years, Rohde was also doing women's fashion illustration. He married a woman named Anna Saab in 1918 and had a son in 1919. Going on, that marriage was short-lived, and he was divorced pretty quickly. And as a single man, he sort of had this freedom to pursue other interests. And so he started attending Knight College's class, some of that being interior design. During this time, he was also illustrating interiors for ad agencies and large department stores like W&J Sloan, which is pictured here. This may not seem like much of a start for a would-be designer, but it was, and it's how Rohde came to meet his second wife, Gladys Forsanger, and she was a copywriter, and her skills and media contacts, she actually worked for Women's Wear Daily, so she was sort of a great PR person and connector for Rohde early on and got him jobs working within these department stores who were also setting trends in the main point of commerce for goods at that point. So as I said, department stores were becoming the chief arbiter of taste in America, and working with them gave Rohde the chance to see the latest styles. It taught him about the importance of merchandising, and the advertising industry already was showing a bit of a bias towards modern design, and that bias likely cemented Rohde's own inclination towards wanting to design, quote, modern furniture. Finally, a job in New York where there was a growing momentum to create an American interpretation of modernism. It is sort of taking hold in Europe at the time. The aesthetic in the United States was sort of a machine age. Think about as streamlining Art Deco. And so it was really tapping into the industrial efficiency and the engineering innovations that were emerging at this time between World War I and World War II. A 4-month trip to Paris and Germany in 1927 seemed to be what Rohde needed to make the leap from an illustrator to a modern furniture designer. In Paris, he likely visited designer showrooms where he saw the latest in what was called French moderne. He then made a very consequential visit to the Bauhaus, the design school in Dessau, Germany. He was the first American industrial designer to spend any real time there. And he saw that the school favored sort of more plain, straightforward style, and it emphasized industrial materials like tubular steel. This is also where Rohde saw modular and systems furniture for the first time, and that would be an idea that he championed in his own designs for the rest of his career. So he no doubt saw what Marcel Breuer was working on in the cabinet shop in Germany. And so those early influences of modernism coming from Europe was super important to Rohde's own development as a designer. The trip was important in another way. It's where he married Gladys. She was, quote, what they called a new woman with a college degree. Only 8% of high school graduates had one at the time. And she also had career ambitions of her own. Like I said, she worked at Women's Wear Daily until 1929. And like I said, she was the one that had the Rolodex packed with very useful contacts. At some point between 1925 and 1927, Rohde started officially referring to himself as Gilbert Rohde. He changed the pronunciation of his name from the German Rohde to Rohde. He likely did both of these things to distance himself from his German heritage. And his wife, as the PR person at this time, thought that that would be better received in advertising. Whatever the case, he was very concerned with creating his public image and persona as a designer. Once back in the US, Rohde began designing tables and desks in his own apartment. He also understood promotion and didn't hesitate to promote himself, boldly contacting his classmate Louis Mumford, who was by then publishing pieces about modern furniture, modern design, and like I said, places like the New Yorker. At the time, modern furniture was being designed as one-offs or custom design for individual clients, but Mumford believed that, quote, designing for the machine and for economy, focusing on durability, design stability, and standardized units embodied social values. Rohde adopted the same stance and would soon begin designing furniture for the furniture industry rather than individuals. This wasn't immediately. His earliest designs included a series of small smoking and chair side tables that were shown at Lord & Taylor. These tables were also included in an important exhibition called Modern American Design in Metal, which was held at the Newark Museum in 1929. His work in that exhibit was what led to a project designing the Lee apartment, a Greenwich Village penthouse. And for that, he designed dual-purpose furniture like this Roderette storage table and bar, which was perfect for smaller living spaces. The Lee apartment was featured in an article in House Beautiful with Rohde's name in the headline. So at the time, super consequential, great PR. One opportunity kept leading to another for Rohde, and he was gaining traction in the design world. It was a referral from an ad agency that led to Rohde's first manufacturing contract. And back then, ad agencies made recommendations to clients, not just about advertising, but also about products themselves, that the agency might thought that would increase sales for clients. So the agency was BBDO, which I believe is still around, and had just gotten the account for Haywood Wakefield Furniture Company, which made wood and wicker furniture. So the agency recommended Rohde as the designer for a new line. That line was called Rohde's Contemporary Group for Sunrooms. And it was considered a metamorphosis or a leap for the company to create and produce modern furniture. The Chicago Tribune critic at the time wrote that the appeal of Rohde's modernism lay in its conservatism. The critic wrote that, quote, nothing he does is startling or bizarre. I love that. This may be one reason that Americans initially were not so hesitant to embrace his designs. They were new enough to be fresh, but not too strange. The most important work he did for Haywood Wakefield was its space-saving, multifunctional, and modular furniture. Things were changing in America during the 1920s and 30s. Houses were getting smaller. There was a huge surge in apartment buildings. And Rohde really understood that the furniture had to change too. His designs were adopted early on, definitely in the coasts, maybe by younger people who were moving into small apartments. For example, there was a sofa that turned into a bed, a 3 case pieces, so like a bookcase and cabinet, a desk drawer and a unit, and a radio cabinet. And they all had identical dimensions so that they could be used in sets or in a pair, so kind of infinite configurability. And that way, Rohde had adapted the European concept of unit furniture to designs for mass production. He also made the idea more palatable to Americans by sticking to a familiar material like wood rather than using metal right off the bat. Perhaps the most important thing Rohde learned from his time with Haywood Wakefield was the concept of designer branding or authored design. So at any rate, Haywood Wakefield's advertising focused as much on Rohde as it did on its products, which you can see from this advertisement here. His cool picture, his name at the top, really sort of beginning that, being the beginning of that era where the designer was positioned alongside the products. And Rohde took that with him to his next gig, which would prove to be the biggest of his career at Herman Miller. So before Rohde, Herman Miller Furniture Company made high quality antique reproduction furniture. So the stuff that you see here on the screen, which really was what every furniture manufacturer at the time was making. In 1930, business at Herman Miller was not great. And DJ Dupree, the president and founder, was doing pretty serious soul searching when Gilbert Rohde walked into Herman Miller's Grand Rapids showroom, trying to sell his modern furniture designs. So it was not love at first sight for Rohde. Dupree was appalled by Rohde's price of $1,000 for the design of a complete bedroom suite. And Dupree also initially had a hard time with the aesthetics of Rohde's furniture, which was pared down, definitely different looking than what you see on the screen. And Dupree thought and told Rohde that he thought his design drawings looked like it was for a high school drafting exercise, which is funny to think about now. But a year later, when Herman Miller showed a $30,000 loss at that time and was probably less than a year away from bankruptcy, Dupree reconsidered. He decided to produce 2 of Rohde's bedroom suites as a trial. He also liked Rohde's suggestion, which was new at the time, which was collecting a 3% royalty, which is an idea that sort of persists in the industry today when manufacturers are working with outside designers. After that decision was made to bring on Rohde, within 6 months, Herman Miller's sales had improved and the company's losses definitely dwindled. And Rohde was determined to sell not just his furniture, but modernism itself. And sort of selling Dupree first on modernism may have been his most important sale. Dupree later wrote, Rohde explained, for his designs, this is a quote, there should be utter simplicity, no surface enrichment, no carvings, no moldings. This brought the necessity of precision. We would not cover up with moldings and carvings. He wrote about using the best material for the job. He used chrome tubing where it was structurally better for the purpose. Nothing could cry for attention. As Dupree understood it, Rohde's design philosophy was that, quote, the furniture should be anonymous. People are important, not furniture. Furniture should be useful. The room is primary. It must be planned for the people who are to live there. He was thinking about people. As a result, the furniture was space-saving, utilitarian, and multi-purpose. Rohde's ideas were revolutionary at the time for an industry in which carvings and inlays and stuff that looked old on purpose was the norm. And Rohde's ideas were this epiphany for Dupree. Within 6 years of Rohde coming on board, Herman Miller would stop making any period furniture and would only make high quality furniture, modern furniture, going forward. By then, Dupree had come to believe that, quote, there was kind of a dishonesty in copying old pieces and faking finishes to get an old world antique look. From that point forward, Rohde's success and Herman Miller's success were tightly intertwined. Rohde would broaden the role of designer. At Herman Miller, he influenced production, marketing, and the design of showrooms. His work for Herman Miller showed that original modern design could become a powerful selling point in mass-produced furniture, and the originality of his designs overcame negative associations at the time with mass production. Rohde would be, as Phyllis Ross said, the guiding light as Herman Miller emerged as the leading American manufacturer of modern furniture. And it was a mutually beneficial relationship. Rohde and Dupree both wanted to reform the furniture industry. Rohde wanted manufacturers to recognize designers by name. Dupree wanted retailers to stop putting their names on product, covering up the name of the manufacturer. In addition, Dupree disliked the industry norm of introducing something new every few years. That fit well with Rohde's desire to create designs that would last. So during the 1930s, industrial designers were restyling products, people were buying them, and the economy was recovering. Exhibitions sponsored by museums and institutions exposed the public to these products as they promoted modernism. Rohde participated in at least 15 design museum exhibitions. He saw them as inexpensive ways to reach thousands and sort of begin the mass public's conversion to modernism for their own homes. He also saw them as a way to build his brand. He did things that made an impression. For a New York exhibit, Rohde was the only designer to show his work in a room setting. So the image shown here, Rohde's title was called The Bachelor's Room. These exhibits combined with articles by and about him that appeared in the press, like Domus Magazine internationally, like I said, House Beautiful, architecture magazines. He was really great at drumming up this press, not only for himself, but for Herman Miller as a company. Another big moment, so the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, entitled The Century of Progress, was perhaps the exhibit that was most important to Rohde's future and Herman Miller's. I like to describe world fairs as like the internet of the time, and it's where big ideas would be presented on a world stage and literally millions of people would come through. So for the 33 World's Fair in Chicago, Rohde designed the interior of a house that was part of an exhibit showing that modern homes and their furnishings were affordable for the average family. There were a number of houses in the exhibit. It's called the Homes of Tomorrow. Most were named for the company that sponsored them, but Gladys, his wife at the time, had the idea to call Rohde's house the Design for Living house after Noel Coward's successful Broadway play by the same name. The set of the play, which is shown here, also included some designs by Rohde. Also got turned into a movie, which you can find. For the Design for Living house, Rohde specified both Haywood Wakefield furniture for the first floor and Herman Miller bedroom sets for the second. One bedroom was furnished with the number 3319 Ash Group, which introduced a new innovation to bedrooms at the time, modular storage units. Up until then, the design of what was considered women's storage was a low chest, and men's storage was a tall chest of drawers. But that meant that storage took up 2 walls, not great utility. So Rohde designed units that had the same form and dimensions so that several could be pushed together on the same wall, more efficient use of space. In addition to specifying furniture, Rohde also decided every detail for the interior of the house, including fabrics, accessories, and lighting. The Design for Living house could be built for $7,000 and visitors could buy plans for just $35. Here's the exterior of it. He promoted the house a lot. He generated articles by sending out press releases and photographs to magazines around the world. Rohde helped create an 8-page brochure, the cover of which is shown here from our archives, that listed all the manufacturers and sources for everything in the house and explained the house's unique features. In addition, 2 attendants or docents were available in the house to explain everything about it to the visitors. The Chicago World's Fair seemed to be the point at which the American public began to accept and be interested in modern design. Sales of modern furniture showed a marked increase after this, especially in the Midwest and New York. More importantly to Rohde's career, this is when DJ Dupree really fully committed to him and his ideas. Dupree visiting the fair, kind of stationing himself in the house, listening to people talking, saw an enthusiastic response to Rohde's designs and understood that Rohde was onto something. So over the next year, Rohde introduced Herman Miller's first coordinated living, sleeping, dining group. He designed and wrote the company's first catalog devoted exclusively to modern furniture and helped orchestrate a franchise program for upscale retailers around the country. So Rohde was changing things in a big way. He was introducing modular designs, he was using an unusual combination of materials, and he was saying that styles didn't have to change every few years. To sell his ideas and designs, he used inventive marketing strategies that appealed to customers on a practical and emotional level. He could appeal to reason because his modular designs made sense in a new age of smaller living spaces. He also offered choices of fabrics and finishes, giving customers a way to personalize their space. Some of those samples are shown here. The idea being that people could customize their interiors according to their lifestyle and their needs, and they could make a space feel like their own and appeal to them on an emotional level. So one example, this 50-piece East India Laurel group from Herman Miller in 1934. It included storage pieces, tables of varying sizes, and multi-purpose elements like a bed/sofa, table/lamp, dinette, dining table. And these pieces could be combined in numerous ways, but the end result was always sophisticated and effective. And each piece, quote, functioned decoratively as an independent piece of furniture. And that was Rohde's genius. So Rohde's designs also reflected contemporary life. For example, desks had storage for portable typewriters, and Herman Miller at that point was marketing them for both the home and office. Dupree supported this modular furniture experiment, even though it meant having to invest in new equipment and a larger sales force. Because Herman Miller's money was being spent on these new investments, Rohde sometimes had to wait for payment. Herman Miller didn't have advertising, PR, marketing departments, or the money to establish them at this point. So Rohde he had experience in them all, and he kind of had to step in to fill the gap. Furthermore, because Rohde was the only person designing modern furniture for Herman Miller, promoting himself in ads and catalogs was essentially the same thing as promoting Herman Miller. To sell modern furniture, Herman Miller had to rethink everything from showrooms to marketing materials. One thing was to introduce the idea of exclusive franchises. Rohde and Herman Miller developed a turnkey approach so that franchises could properly stage the furniture. Herman Miller would ship 7 prefabricated knockdown rooms to the franchises, along with a store manual that Rohde wrote himself. It specified furniture, upholstery, window and wall treatments, complete with paint color chips, wallpaper samples, and fabric swatches. Retailers also regularly receive bulletins that positioned the products and included a script for how to sell them. These bulletins also reported on the success of several participants. Some of these department stores sold out of their Herman Miller inventory 8 times in 1 year, and that was even during the Depression. So sales materials made use of third-party endorsement, citing people who know, aka Rohde's writers, press that had written about Rohde in the past. Since the furniture itself wasn't changing from season to season, redecorating was essential to keeping customers interested. Rohde's interiors were simple with an emphasis on subtle contrasts. These might include textured fabrics offset by smooth surfaces of glass, metal, and natural wood veneers. Rohde also created a traveling display of 1/8 scale models, so tiny furniture, which I think still happens in the industry today. We have a lot of tiny furniture, but Rohde said they, quote, demonstrated in a moment a concept that was often difficult to explain with words. So I mentioned the store manual Rohde did. The Authentic Style Book of Modern Furniture was a supplement to that manual. It explained what he called the grouping principle and, quote, showed how grouping added functionality without sacrificing floor space and crowding. Sample floor plans were helpfully labeled modern and not modern so people could learn the difference. The style book was also shamelessly self-promotional, referring to Rohde as, quote, the country's foremost modernist. Rohde also wrote the 20th Century Modern Furniture Catalog. So this was the first one, a first American trade catalog devoted entirely to modern design. And it had an introduction from Rohde that explained the logic of modern design and included photographs by, at that point, a known architectural photographer, Heydrich Blessing. And really, it felt more like a magazine than a catalog. So not only was Rohde designing furniture and promoting himself, Herman Miller and modern design, but he was also overseeing a redesign of the graphic style of Herman Miller's advertising, branding, stationery catalogs. He wanted a style that reflected and reinforced modernism. So that equals a new style that used sans serif font instead of cursive. The lettering itself was bold and sometimes accompanied by blocks of color. All Rohde's efforts paid off. At a Wanamaker store in New York in 1936, inventory of Rohde's products sold out 12 times in 1 year. So it really was a combination of Rohde's marketing work and his designs that helped establish Herman Miller in its reputation as a leader of modern furniture. Dupree regularly acknowledged Rohde's impacts on the company, and he always felt the meeting with Rohde, in his words, was nothing short of providential. Rohde had a brief but important stint in design education. In 1935, he became the director of a new industrial design school called the Design Laboratory, which was at the time was part of the Works Progress Administration. Its mission was to train designers and design teachers free of charge. And this is a picture of Rohde working in the design lab. While Rohde only had room for 385 students, 1,230 showed up, an indication of the level of interest in industrial design as a profession at this time. Rohde was a huge advocate of learning by doing and fostered a spirit of spontaneous exploration. You could say the school took a liberal arts approach to industrial design because students also had to take fine arts classes in addition to design classes. This is influenced by Rohde and what he saw at the Bauhaus, where it was also a multidisciplinary approach to design that also encouraged students to design for mass production. However, Rohde added something to the curriculum that the Bauhaus did not have, and that was an emphasis on merchandising and the saleability of the designs. In that regard, he was breaking new ground. No other industrial design programs at that time included merchandising in their curriculum. Rohde was the school's full-time director for only about a year, but he had a profound influence on the direction. So after that, in 1937, Rohde went to the International Exhibit of Art and Technology and Modern Life in Paris, and he was there to look at exhibition design because he was anticipating designing for yet another World's Fair in New York in 1939. But at the same time, he was seeing new furniture and interiors on display at the exhibit. This trip seems to have inspired his later designs he did that kind of emphasized more of a luxurious approach and incorporated some surrealist elements, which you can see in the recently reintroduced and one of my personal favorites, Paldeo tables on the right. I also love the vanity that you see on the left. So Rohde was prolific in designing vanities for his lines for Herman Miller, which at the time was also a response to second wave feminism. And women were leaving the house to do stuff. So you needed a really cool piece of furniture to sit and get ready. Also just an amazing piece that is wild looking. So in this way, Rohde was again a bridge between design in Europe and America, just as he had been when he visited the Bauhaus a decade before and saw modular furniture. As I said, his designs definitely, after the trip, reflected what he had seen there. The most famous example, and is probably big influence after that trip, was this idea of biomorphic design. So the quote ectoplastic desk and coffee table that were part of the Paldeo group for Herman Miller were the first manufactured biomorphic designs in America. So biomorphism would become a hallmark of not only mid-century modern furniture design, but modern art itself. And this was a departure from the look of modernism from even a few years earlier. But Rohde explained that with the then improved economy, it was, quote, appropriate and necessary to go beyond strict and spare functionalism and to humanize design. The Executive Office Group was another first in America, and this was the first systems-based approach to manufactured office furniture. Customers were able to use a kit of parts to customize desks, tables, and workstations in general. The catalog describes the group as, quote, office furniture that is modern from the inside as well as the outside, modern in the way it works as well as the way it looks. In this sense, the Executive Office Group catalog you see here was as much as a manifesto as it was a catalog of offerings. By encouraging customers to select from over 200 combinations and variations, Rohde underscored the variety and utility of Herman Miller products. The Executive Office Group planted the seeds for a human-centered approach to office design that future Herman Miller designers like Robert Probst and Bill Stumpf, people like Florence Knoll, who would continue to refine and redefine in the industry. And the product catalog was just as revolutionary as the concept it promoted. It had bold graphics, black and white printing with red accents, and a new technique that combined photography and sketches. It was largely the work of Peggy Ann Mack, who was Rohde's former student and employee and would go on to be his third wife. In 1941, Rohde married Peggy Ann Mack, and they would go on to become really partners in Rohde's design office. In 1941, Herman Miller opened a 6,000 square foot showroom at One Park Avenue in New York, noteworthy because it was the first manufacturer showroom in America that showed only modern design. Visitors to the showroom were, quote, stunned and overwhelmed by the Fantasyland showroom. It had floor-to-ceiling drapes, plants, quilted walls, and looked, and this is the quote from a salesman at the time, about as far out for 1941 as a Star Wars set. So visitors ask questions like, wow, can I have this? Can I live in this kind of space? Can I afford it? When can I have it? Rohde was ahead of the curve in so many ways. He introduced systems furniture and biomorphic shapes to Americans. He also, similar to later Alexander Girard, would accessorize and sort of style these spaces with folk art or indigenous art that he would collect on travels around the world. And that's, again, a move that's usually associated with the Eameses and Girard, but Rohde was doing it first. And he was also the first to recognize that different kinds of work needed different kinds of furnishings. He called it the living room effect in offices where work centered around discussions rather than paperwork. By now, you might be thinking, why isn't Rohde more recognized in the design world? And one reason, according to Phyllis Ross, is that Rohde's contributions happened at the same time as America's growing involvement in World War II, and this really obscured at the time the significance of Rohde's achievement. She also once wryly noted that it's because he made the mistake of dying young, and that there is a lot of truth in that. In fact, he was part of a group that was working to found the Society of Industrial Designers in 1944, but died a few months before it was chartered, and he was removed from the list of charter members. Rohde died suddenly on June 16th, 1944, of a heart attack. The Herman Miller lore is he had just finished lunch with Peggy at a bistro in New York City across from his office. And supposedly his last words after eating some French pastry was, "This is the best French pastry I've ever had." And then he keeled over. Hard to believe. Peggy would go on to complete projects that were still ongoing for Herman Miller. And then 2 years later, the company would go on to hire George Nelson as its design director. So Gilbert Rohde managed to accomplish quite a lot in just 20 years. He designed for people and their living problems. His modular designs gave people more living space in small apartments, and some of his designs accommodated the technology of the time, typewriters. He also introduced systems furniture to Americans. As Ross pointed out, quote, the flexibility intrinsic in his coordinated lines for home and office addressed change as a condition of modern living. A few years later, he introduced biomorphic designs. Other designers would soon follow his lead. He introduced the royalty payment model in the furniture industry. He expanded the role of designer to include marketing and promotion, and understood the power of designer branding and used it to great effect. While Rohde didn't succeed in making modernism the style of America in his lifetime, his work did succeed in getting America's attention and laying the groundwork for future modern designers. When talking about his work with Herman Miller, George Nelson said, quote, we stood on Rohde's shoulders and moved from there. While the we he's referring to is Herman Miller, it is also true of America's modern designers. And that is it. So thank you all for coming to this history lesson today. If you enjoyed the CEU, there are other designer CEUs that we do that I sometimes have the pleasure to deliver. And that's it. I guess we can see if there's any questions after my very thorough presentation.
Thank you, Amy. As I mentioned, please feel free to add any questions into the chat. We're getting a lot of claps, accolades. Thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thank you. Keeping it on the Swiss cheese wall, as they called it, which is one of my favorite elements of the old New York showroom.
And everybody's been mentioning very informative. I agree. What a fascinating presentation and history of Gilbert Rohde. It's so cool.
Rohde
Thank you so
rules.
much.
Yeah. Really fun to share, and look forward to the next one. And I hope everybody now has this like newfound love for Rohde. He's definitely one of my favorites, and it's really exciting that after all of these years, we're producing his furniture again. So it's something you can enjoy now, which is super cool too.
We have one question actually from Brenda. Did DJ Dupree write business is unusual because of Rohde?
I mean, I think Rohde is the first entry into a very unusual business, or just all of these kind of really pivotal decisions within our own business that ended up affecting culture at large. And so that book, I love it. It starts off with Rohde, and I think goes on to include, all of the designers DJ and the Duprees would end up collaborating with.
Very cool. Somebody else asked about the recording, so I commented back that we will post a recording in a couple of days on MillerKnoll's YouTube channel. And any other questions before we wrap up? I don't see any.
Cool.
Thank you, everyone, for joining
Thanks,
today.
everyone.
And thank you, Amy, so much for delivering such an amazing presentation. We really appreciate it. And we hope you join next month. We'll be sending out an email with the topic, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Yay. Bye, everyone.
Have a great day.